Yes, colleagues, welcome. We are going to talk about the International Criminal Court in Maidan, the latest one. So our speaker is going to be Mr. Crowe, Barrister, England and Wales, consultant for the GRC. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Matthew Crowe. I'm a barrister from England, and I'm a consultant for Global Rights Compliance. Global Rights Compliance is a group of international lawyers from London and also here in Kiev. We're currently undertaking a project for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of England into matters of international humanitarian law, also known as the law of war. I'm here today to discuss the International Criminal Court prosecutor's recent preliminary report into whether criminal activity and international crimes were committed at Maidan. In short, and this is coming across as controversial in Ukraine, the ICC prosecutor has said of Maidan, no war crimes were committed, and that there is not enough information at this stage to find that crimes against humanity were committed in Maidan. Today, I'll discuss why she has said that and what is next. First of all, let me address what this report actually is. Every year, the ICC prosecutor releases a report to summarize her activities and her findings about all the preliminary examinations going on around the world. As you can see, there's currently around 9 preliminary examinations. They include Palestine, Colombia, Nigeria, and of course Ukraine. Right now in Ukraine, the prosecutor has to work out whether there's a reasonable basis to believe that crimes against humanity, war crimes, or even genocide have been committed in the territory of Ukraine or by Ukrainian citizens since the 21st November 2013 to date. To provide an update on that, the prosecutor releases this report every year. And in fact, this was only published a little over a week ago. So the report only addresses Maidan and only addresses crimes against humanity because that's how far the prosecutor has got. To assist with her preliminary examination into Maidan, the ICC prosecutor has received around 20 communications, which is essentially information about alleged crimes in Maidan, and is focused specifically between the 21st November 2013 and the 22nd of February 2014. To put that relatively low number of 20 into context, the prosecutor actually received 3,854 about Georgia since 2008. On average, that's around 550 per year, and that's quite a large sum compared to Ukraine's 20. The prosecutor has also met with Ukrainian authorities, members of civil societies, and several intergovernmental organizations. Now, the crucial question, what does this report actually say? First, for war crimes, the prosecutor said there is no war crimes in Maidan. The reason for this is very simple. There was no war at the time. More importantly, and secondly, the prosecutor believes that at this stage, there's limited information to say that any crimes against humanity were committed at Maidan. Now, before I address the findings, it's worth briefly outlining the law about crimes against humanity. There are 4 main ingredients that have to be met to prove a crime against humanity. First, that there is an act outlined in the ICC's governing law in Article 7. This includes things like murder, torture, persecution. Second, that the act was committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack. Third, the attack is directed against a civilian population. In other words, there was a policy of the state to attack civilians. And lastly, that the perpetrator had knowledge of the attack. In relation to each of these, the prosecutor has found that there are some acts, such as killings, torture, persecution. She's even found that some of these acts were directed against civilians pursuant to a state policy to attack the population in order to suppress the protest movement at Maidan. But the third finding is that there's limited information to support the conclusion that this attack was either widespread or systematic. Now let me take those in turn. First, the acts, in summary, she believes happened in Maidan was murder, torture, persecution because of civilians' opposition to the government, and other inhumane acts, such as excessive force, beatings, serious injuries. The second element, the policy element. In most cases, the existence of a state or organizational policy is inferred from things such as repeated actions. There's a sequence, there's preparations or mobilization of people and a coordinated action by a state. And now that's not easy to prove, but according to this preliminary report, there is sufficient evidence to believe that the violent attacks were carried out in pursuant to.
Ну, існує така інформація, що достатньо доказів того, що це відбувалося, і все залежить від державної політики, яка проводиться урядом. Це базується на повторюванні, скажімо, таких насильницьких порушень і, скажімо, відносно волонтерів Майдану, ну, мається на увазі тітушок або таких невизначених осіб. Ці індивідууми, вони говорили про протести, і там стосовно урядових структур, вони багато разів неспроможні були зупинити такі насильницькі дії, або їх взагалі не просто зупинити, а припинити. І були такі зусилля, якимось чином приховати або заховати такі злочини, які відбувалися під час Майдану. Це дуже важливо. І по-друге, що не менш важливо, чи були ці дії, які я згадав декілька хвилин тому, чи вони були широко поширені, були якісь систематичні напади або атаки на людей, що стояли на Майдані. Я не можу, дуже важко переоцінити це, але на основі цієї обмеженої інформації, яка мається у прокурора ICC на цьому етапі, вона змогла зробити висновок, що немає достатніх доказів.
To be widespread, an attack must be large scale, it has to be massive, frequent, carried out collectively, and have considerable seriousness and a multiplicity of victims. At this time, the prosecutor believes there's simply not enough information to support the conclusion that the attack had sufficient intensity and geographic scope to be a crime against humanity. Now, even though these demonstrations continued for over 3 months, and did involve a large number of protesters, apparently the incidents occurred sporadically and during a limited number of clashes and confrontations between the forces and protesters. The report also notes that the majority of these alleged acts occurred in a small area, namely around Maidan, that is opposed to across the country or a region. The prosecutor also goes on to say about widespread that even though 700 civilians were injured after participating in this, only a portion of these injuries may constitute the serious underlying acts required by the Rome Statute. Now, as mentioned, those acts are things like torture, inhumane treatment, and apparently only a small portion of the injuries reach that level of severity. So there's limited information to support the idea that the attack was widespread. But there's also an alternative requirement. Was the attack systematic? Now, this refers to the organized nature of the acts and the improbability of their random occurrence. In essence, it's about patterns. The ICC prosecutor also concluded there's insufficient information to say that these acts in the attack was systematic. Now, the reasoning for this is difficult to understand. But the prosecutor considers that the acts appear to have occurred in an infrequent and often more reactive manner, which it was determined by the different circumstances and developing circumstances during the demonstrations. In particular, the prosecutor believes, on initial information, that the acts occurred as part of an excessive, violent response to a perceived threat to public order. And it's perhaps worth quoting the prosecutor on this. She said, "The alleged acts were rather a reaction to events, however unjustified and disproportionate, and aimed to limit the protests rather than being part of a deliberate, coordinated plan of violence methodically carried out against the protest movement. Therefore, based on those findings and limited information, there cannot be a crime against humanity at Maidan at this stage." Now, those are the preliminary findings. What does it really mean? Legally, it does raise questions. I won't dwell too much on this, and I do not have access to all the information the ICC prosecutor does. But the findings about there being a state policy and the attacks being systematic are somewhat difficult to reconcile. She appears to say that the acts are not random, and there is a campaign which suggests a policy to attack protesters on the one hand, but then goes on to say that the attack was not systematic because the acts followed an irregular pattern and no coordinated plan. So when it comes to the ultimate finding about Maidan, the ICC prosecutor will have to reconcile these factual findings. But perhaps more importantly than this, her preliminary assessment will change if she receives sufficient new information and facts about Maidan. In short, the door is not closed about crimes against humanity at Maidan. This should be an encouragement for civil society and for all stakeholders to assist the ICC prosecutor in revisiting her view. She has said there is sufficient information to find that there's a policy. She has said there's sufficient information to believe there's underlying acts in accordance with Article 7, but not enough to prove that the attack was widespread or systematic. We believe that stakeholders should aim their efforts at the 3 points on the screen. 1, to send in information that the acts of violence were against a larger group of victims and/or covered a larger geographical area outside of Maidan. 2, that those acts of violence, including in Kiev, were of sufficiently serious nature, whether singularly or cumulatively, to constitute one of those underlying acts in Article 7. And 3, information that the acts of violence were the result of a planned or a calculated methodology or a system or just a pattern, and not merely the result of panic or an excessive response from the authorities. I and Global Rights Compliance hopes that stakeholders, such as civil society and authorities, will take on this mantle of challenging these findings and sending in information, because only then will the ICC prosecutor reconsider her views. Otherwise, the preliminary examination continues into the East. But ultimately, on a final note, Ukraine should not forget that it is the state with the primary obligation to prosecute. That is not the ICC's job. It's Ukraine's job and its duty. Those are my comments about the examination. I will happily take any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I believe we have a first question. Natalie Polan.
Spread and systematic, this criteria. So if the findings are that there was a state policy, right, that there was a repetition of violence, why do we keep saying that that was a reaction, that it wasn't deliberate? I mean, how do you draw the line between whether there was a coordinated plan or it was just an impulsive reaction? And in this regard, the law enforcement officers who killed the protesters on Maidan, well, they took orders. It wasn't some simultaneous decision. I mean, they all took orders from the government. Doesn't it design that there was a coordinated plan?
In my view, yes. I think you answered the problem that you posed there. You mentioned about the consideration that these attacks or these acts were just a reaction, so according to the prosecutor. In my view, that's not strictly relevant. She does initially say that there was a coordinated campaign and an operation, and that these attacks were not the mere aggregate of random acts, but then goes on to say that they were just a reaction, even if it was disproportionate. Now that looks at the motive of why they were acting, that it was a reaction. That looks at why they responded. What it doesn't take into account is that there were maybe orders, that there maybe is information, that the way they reacted was still systematized. And if the way they reacted was in a planned way and was in a patterned way, that satisfies the element. But it's worth remembering that this is just a preliminary report. This is just based on initial information. But in my view, you're quite right.
Okay, so and about the widespread, so there is no large scale, right? That's the problem. And how do you, what is the large scale? I mean, we have more than 100 people died in Maidan. Isn't it enough? I mean, and what is enough then?
Absolutely, and 100 people and 700 injured is more than enough. In the case in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there was around 200 people, civilians, died. And the reason why those were crimes against humanity is because the attack against those civilians was systematic. It's not based on the number of people who've died. It's based on the way in which it's done. So the widespread element doesn't have to be proven for crimes against humanity. You can prove that it was done in a systematic way. And if 100 people were killed in a way that clearly evinces a pattern or clearly shows that there was a plan, that is a crime against humanity. So 100 people, putting it bluntly, is enough for a crime against humanity. It's the way in which it was done that matters. And that is what stakeholders and civil society should now focus on.
And one more question. If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned the genocide crime in the beginning of your speech. Can you deliberate on that, please?
Yeah, the prosecutor is only focused on crimes against humanity. It seems there is no real genuine question about whether there is a genocide at Maidan. Genocide requires a massive event and an intention to destroy, whole or in part, a certain degree of people and a certain group of people. It doesn't seem there's any question about that at Maidan. Certainly there does seem that people have been persecuted and injured because of their beliefs, their opposition to the government, but not an intention of the state to destroy an entire group of people.
Thank you very much. Якщо є ще питання, то зараз.
Any further question?
If not, I'll just ask the last question, if I may. So you said this is a preliminary report, and
Yes.
the door, the so-called door, is still open. Until when is the door open before the final report is out?
It's impossible to say. The prosecutor has grouped the two declarations from the government. She's grouped them so that there is now one situation of Ukraine. The one in the east and the one in Maidan have been grouped together. It seems they will take a few years to be able to report back on those, and the determination on Maidan will come with the determination on crimes in the east. And it'll be many years, I anticipate, before that. What we can expect is next year, around the same time, we'll get another preliminary examination report addressing whether new information has been received about crimes against humanity at Maidan. So maybe sometime.
So just making an assumption, if we put together both Maidan crimes and the situation in the east of Ukraine, that can go for crime against humanity.
They are different events and different situations. If they're all part of the same policy to attack civilians, they could be, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for clarification and thank you
very
for
much.
presentation. Шановні колеги, на цьому будемо завершувати нашу прес-конференцію.
Dear colleagues, with this we will finish our press conference, and I would like to remind you that at 4 p.m. we will have additional briefing and